good day there. Happy 4th of July if you're in the United States. This is Joe Van Cleve and welcome to another episode of the Typewriter video series. Today I want to talk about a little bit different of a subject, which is an article that appeared in the recently in the Atlantic magazine's website, and it was about the history of the word processor, which I think has some relevance to the typewriter. This recent article in the Atlantic was really a book review and interview by the author Matthew Kirschenbaum of his new book Track Changes, which is one of the few authoritative histories of the word processor. And so I read the article. I have not read the book yet. I have it on order. So I want to comment a little bit about what the article said and how it relates perhaps to our beloved subject of typewriters here. So one of the things is that word processors descended from typewriters, and they also obsoleted the typewriter. And as far removed from the typewriter as today's digital media is, any text-based document still has the typewriter's fingerprints all over it. The typewriter's genetics are embedded in any Word file, for instance. You know, when you look at the print preview mode in a Word document, you're seeing it appear on the screen as if it was typewritten. So there is this direct lineage of typewritten documents that are still relevant in the age of the word processor and the computer. Another interesting fact about the early history of the word processor is a lot of popular fiction and science fiction authors embraced the word processor early on because of its efficiency and speed that enabled them to publish multiple books per year, which was back in the 1980s, that was one of the only ways you could make a living at writing in those genres. So there was a point about efficiency and speed that helped them move from the typewriter to the word processor. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of talk these days about typewriters and how they might be less distractive in the writing process. But I might point out that in the early days of the word processor, the computer platforms that these word processors were hosted on generally didn't have the internet. You didn't have the distractions of the internet in the early word processors. They really were kind of more purpose-built for word processing because there were fewer alternatives to word processing that you could do on a computer other than primitive 8-bit graphics, games, and maybe spreadsheets and those kind of business applications compared to today where a full-blown computer is a minefield of alternative distractions, of course, from the writing process itself. One of the interesting things this article pointed out was that word processors aren't typewriters connected to TV screens. It's really the memory device in the system that makes it the word processor. And I'll give you an example. One of the very first devices that you could truly call a word processor was the IBM MT/ST, which was a magnetic tape selectric typewriter. It was a desk-sized machine that costed about $10,000, and it essentially was a selectric typewriter connected to a magnetic tape drive that enabled you to do corrections to the document electronically and then print out a corrected version right on the typewriter. So it's really the memory device that makes it into a word processor. Typewriters are physical, single-purpose built machines built for writing, whereas word processors are systems built onto general-purpose computers. And so in the days of the typewriter, editing and a writing process was editing and revising using paper, whereas now in the age of the word processor, the writing process is editing and revising using software. So once the word processor came along, much of that materiality of the editing and working process with paper went away. And that changed the whole nature of writing. Another interesting aspect of the typewriter/word processor history is the social aspect in the workplace. As you may well know, the typewriter liberated women into the workplace, giving them a job market, a job career as secretaries in the late 19th and 20th century. The rise of the word processor kind of did away with that role of the secretary, because pretty much most everybody in the office environment now does their own word processing. In the early days of the typewriter, or early days of the word processor, I should say, word processors were so technically specific that you still had the picture of the boss, who was usually a male, dictating via voice to his secretary, who would then be the specialist who would do the word processing on the paper. So there was still that kind of gender social hierarchy. But so the typewriter to word processor change that happened in the 1970s and 80s was more than just a technological change. It was really a sociological change, because you don't see the role of secretaries much anymore. One of the anecdotes about this that was mentioned in this book and article was that John Updike, the writer, was a typewriter user for most of his career, and then he finally got his first word processor, which was a Wang system. And they have his last typewriter is in a museum, I think, or an archive at a university. And the last ribbon used in his last typewriter is still in the machine. And the author of this book studied the ribbon to see what was the last thing written on his last typewriter. And the last thing written on John Updike's typewriter was a note to his secretary telling her that he won't be needing her typing services anymore because he's now gotten a word processor. Which I think is really interesting. That's an interesting story. Now, another aspect about word processors is that for the last 20 or 30 years, word processors have been built onto general purpose computing platforms that offer all kinds of other distractions. But the book did make note of this recent trend back toward purpose-built word processors. For instance, there's this software called Write Room. And then you might be aware of this device called a FreeWriter, which is a keyboard, pseudo typewriter kind of dedicated word processor, similar to, in some degrees, to the AlphaSmart devices. That is more of a purpose-built word processing keyboard. So the author of this book, interestingly enough, though he doesn't appear to be a typewriter fan, seems to acknowledge that the future of word processing might be going back to more purpose-built, specific word processing devices other than the general purpose computer platform. It's interesting that the essentials of what a typewriter is hasn't really gone away. It's just morphed from physical paper more into the virtual software realm. I think for me, one of the most interesting parts of this article were the parts that related to the science fiction author Isaac Asimov, who was an early proponent of the word processor on the computer and also documented some of his experiences in transitioning from the typewriter to the word processor in articles in Omni magazine. It's interesting that when he brought his first computer home for use as a word processor, was a Radio Shack TRS-80 system, he wanted to put it into his office. But his wife was adamant that he put it into the living room because it had a TV-like screen, a CRT screen. So there is, right away, early on, there is this problem in computer-based word processors where you're not really sure if it's a productivity tool or an entertainment tool. And as it turns out in this anecdotal story, he ended up putting the computer in the living room, and he discovered that because typing on the computer keyboard was a lot less noisy than typing on his old typewriter, that he could actually watch television while he was writing. So right there you can see this is the seed of the problem with computer-based word processing. It was evident way back then, and I think that's a great anecdote. So, you know, there was inevitable distractions built into computer-based word processing, and I think that's just an enormously important nugget of information. Now, when we're talking about non-distracted word processing or the non-distracted writing process, of course manual typewriters can be one way of doing that. There are, of course, a lot of other word processor applications that are intending to be a more of a non-distractive kind of a writing environment, but there's a couple hardware solutions to this problem. One of those, probably the most popular one, is this, the AlphaSmart. Now this is the Neo version of the AlphaSmart. I bought this a few years ago, new. They were made by Renaissance Learning. And Renaissance Learning is still in business, but they don't make the AlphaSmarts anymore. But you can still get these on eBay and Amazon and places like that very inexpensively. It has a great keyboard. It has a built-in text editor style word processor. There is a USB communications port that works to actually transfer the files as files to your computer, either your Mac or PC. You have to use this dedicated software that you have to install on your computer. But even without that software, if you hit the send key, it will just transmit the text document that you're currently in, one character at a time, like rapid typing, into whatever window you have open on your computer. So there's several different ways of using it. It has internal memory that you cannot expand, but it's about a 50,000 word memory. It has 8 basically function keys that you can store individual files on, but you can also store files as named files. You can save them as named files. There are so many features to the AlphaSmart Neo, and I've written several times in my blog about them, but I'm going to dedicate a future episode of this series to the AlphaSmart Neo. But just know that there is an alternative to a general purpose computer for word processing, a more of a purpose-built writing instrument such as the AlphaSmart Neos, and these are really good if you don't want to mess with paper and ink and typewriters, that kind of a writing process. You can do this. When it comes to word processing, or I should say the process of writing, it is possible to use a manual typewriter or an electric typewriter in that workflow in the modern context of word processing and computers. And one way you can do that is to use OCR software, optical character recognition software. You can use these in your Mac or your PC, and you can also use them in Android and iOS portable mobile devices. There's even I think with Google Docs, there is a feature on Google Docs where it will OCR a photo image of typewritten text and turn it into a text file or a PDF file. So there's a lot of options these days available for OCR, and the OCR software itself is getting better and better than it ever has. So the basic workflow for OCR using a typewriter is you're going to rough draft your first draft as typewritten text. Then you can photograph or scan those sheets, upload them to your software, and then let the software turn them into text files. And from there, you can import them into your favorite word processor and finish them up as finished documents. You might ask yourself, why would you want to go to that roundabout method? Why not just use a laptop, a computer, and be done with the typewriter? Well, the answer has to do with, I'll draw an analogy. A lot of photographers like the mechanical touch and feel of manual film cameras and their lenses. And there's this idea of a hybrid workflow where you can shoot film, scan it into a digital file. So you end up with a digital workflow in the post-production phase, but you work with the camera out in the field in a mechanical hands-on kind of an approach. And the same is true with using manual typewriters as an intermediary device, a rough draft device. Because I think it's still valid to rough draft on a typewriter if you enjoy that kind of thing, but then you can scan or photograph them, OCR the documents, and finish them up as digital files. Well, this is Joe Van Cleve, and I hope this has been an informative and thought-provoking session for you to think about the history of the word processor as it relates to the typewriter. And until next time, you have yourself a great day.